14-year-old Maya Rourke entered the courtroom with a smirk that made every heart in the gallery freeze solid. She glanced at the grieving relatives in the front row and tilted her chin upward as if the 4 counts of first-degree murder pinned to her name were someone else's problem entirely. Her father had been an FBI special agent. Her mother had been the kindest woman on the block. Her 2 younger siblings had been children who still believed bedtime stories could keep them safe. Maya killed them all. She thought her age would protect her. She thought her father's training had taught her how to beat the system. But the most damning witness in that courtroom was not a detective, not a relative, and not a confession. It was a neighbor's garage camera that caught a small figure slipping out at 3:17 in the morning, carrying something long wrapped in a towel. She did not know that footage existed, and she did not know her sentence was already written. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way. If you believe in accountability, subscribe now and tell us what you think below. Because this case is not just about what happened inside one house. It is about the moment a community realizes a child can be dangerous, and the moment the system decides whether the word child is an explanation or an excuse. This is how it all began. Before the blood tests, before the warrants, before the courtroom, there was a quiet cul-de-sac in Ashford Ridge, the kind of suburb that sells itself on safety. Trimmed lawns, flagpoles, and school fundraiser banners, neighbors who wave but never pry too deeply. The family at the center of this story looked like a brochure for American stability. Special Agent Daniel Rourke was structured, respected, and disciplined. He was the kind of father who taught his daughter how to change a tire and how to spot a lie. Erin Rourke, his wife, kept the household stitched together with routines and warmth. 2 younger children still lived in the age of soft things, blanket forts and cartoon mornings. And Maya, the eldest, had already begun collecting tiny rebellions, secret accounts, private messages, quiet defiances that looked harmless until the night they were not. The last normal family photograph, taken just weeks before the murders, shows Maya half turned away from the camera, already leaving. The gavel had not fallen yet, but the countdown had already begun. Ashford Ridge did not feel like a place that bred headlines. It had a predictable rhythm that made people feel safe simply by living inside it. Morning joggers traced the same loops past the same driveways. School buses arrived and departed with the consistency of a clock that never needed winding. Garage doors yawned open at 7:30 sharp and closed again by 6 each evening. The neighborhood had a sameness that people purchased on purpose, paying mortgage rates for the illusion that routine could keep catastrophe at arm's length. The Rourkes were woven into that rhythm so completely that neighbors considered them a permanent fixture, the kind of family that proved the system worked. Daniel coached a youth safety workshop once a year. Erin organized meal trains when someone on the block fell ill. Their children were known by first name at the local library. Their image was not just good, it was useful, the kind that reassured everyone else their own lives were on stable ground. Daniel Rourke's FBI credentials made people assume he was hard, maybe emotionally distant, maybe too serious for neighborhood barbecues. But the truth was quieter than that. At home, his discipline looked like rituals rather than strictness. Saturday pancakes with the kids, where the batter had to be mixed in a specific order because Daniel believed consistency mattered even in small things. Sunday car washes that turned into games, the hose spraying small feet while the younger children squealed. Checklists taped inside kitchen cabinets, not because Daniel was rigid, but because he believed preparation was a form of love. He locked doors twice every night, checked windows, activated the security system with the patience of someone who understood exactly what the world could do when no one was paying attention. He also taught Maya things most children never learn: situational awareness, the weight of consequences, the idea that choices leave tracks that outlast the moment. That teaching would later haunt investigators, because if anyone's child understood how evidence worked, it should have been his. Erin balanced Daniel's gravity with warmth that made the household feel lived in rather than managed. She was the one who handled the social architecture Daniel did not have time or temperament for. Teacher conferences, dentist appointments, in sibling arguments dissolved with humor and patience rather than authority. Friends described her as the person who texted back immediately, the person who noticed when someone at the table was too quiet. She made the house feel like a home rather than a headquarters. In private, she worried about Maya's mood swings and growing secrecy, but she framed it as adolescence rather than danger. Erin had been keeping a small notebook of parenting strategies, names of counselors, school resources, questions to ask Maya about friendships and moods, as if organization alone could keep a family safe, as if writing down the right steps would prevent the wrong ones. That notebook would later surface as evidence, a heartbreaking record of a mother trying to fix something she did not yet know was unfixable. The two younger children were still in the age of innocence that adults spend the rest of their lives mourning once it passes. Their rooms looked like any other rooms belonging to children that age, scattered toys and half-finished homework and little shoes lined up by the bed in uneven rows. They trusted their parents the way small children trust gravity, without question and without alternative. They believed their father could stop anything bad from happening because he carried a badge and spoke with certainty. They believed their mother's goodnight kisses worked like shields. Investigators who later processed those bedrooms described them as the most difficult part of the house, not because of what happened there, but because of what was left behind. Unfinished coloring books, a half-read bedtime story with the page still dog-eared, and a glass of water on a nightstand that no one would ever drink. Empathy in true crime is often built not from what was destroyed, but from what did not get finished. Maya Rourke, at 14, could shift faces with an ease that unsettled adults who noticed it. At school, she was bright, sometimes charming, sometimes cutting in a way that teachers filed under strong personality rather than examining too closely. She earned grades that reflected capability without passion, the kind of performance that says a student is smart enough to succeed, but not invested enough to care. Friends knew her as a girl who joked about rules while carefully watching how adults reacted to the joke. She tested boundaries not with rebellion, but with observation, studying which lines could be crossed and which ones triggered consequences. Online, she curated a sharper version of herself entirely. Captions about being misunderstood, little bursts of cruelty framed as humor, reposted quotes about independence that read like manifestos when examined later. She wanted an audience. But more than that, she wanted control. In the months before the murders, Daniel tightened boundaries in the house with the practiced hand of someone who identified threats professionally. The trigger was not dramatic. Maya had been messaging an older boy connected to a nearby high school, and Daniel saw risk where Maya saw excitement. Phones were checked, locations were shared. Social media access was limited and monitored. To Daniel, these were preventive measures, the same logic that made him lock doors twice and check windows before sleep. To Maya, said they were humiliation on a scale she could not tolerate. At dinner, the arguments were quiet, but surgical. Neither father nor daughter raised their voice, which somehow made the tension worse, like a pressure cooker with the valve sealed. Erin tried to mediate, softening Daniel's positions, translating Maya's anger into adolescent language he might accept. But even Erin's softness became a tool Maya could exploit, crying to one parent and freezing out the other until the household felt less like a family and more like a chessboard. The child learned where the kings stood. Neighbors later remembered a small moment from the week before everything changed. Maya was outside at dusk, sitting on the front steps, staring at the street with the kind of focus that does not belong to boredom. She seemed to be watching the rhythm of the block, or the timing of traffic, the pattern of lights switching on in houses, the intervals at which people emerged and retreated. A neighbor waved. Maya waved back without looking. At the time, it seemed like a teenager lost in thought. In hindsight, it looked like rehearsal. The most chilling crimes begin not as explosions, but as thoughts practiced in silence until the silence becomes a blueprint. And by the time Ashford Ridge heard its first siren, Maya's private countdown had already reached its final numbers. The neighborhood slept, entirely unaware it was living beside a plan. The smirk stayed, until the screen lit up. The final day of the Rourke family moved with a cruelty that only normalcy can deliver. There was nothing in those 24 hours that signaled catastrophe. Aaron posted a quick photograph of the younger children's school project on a group chat, adding a smiling comment about glue getting everywhere. Daniel stopped for gas on his way home from the field office, bought a coffee, and chatted with the clerk about a coming storm front. Maya went through her classes with the practiced ease of someone whose mind was somewhere else entirely, laughing at lunch, turning in an assignment, answering a teacher's question with enough effort to avoid scrutiny. Every one of those actions would later be examined for hidden meaning, for some signal that should have screamed catastrophe. But the ordinary is not a warning system. It is the disguise tragedy wears when it wants to arrive undetected. In hindsight, every mundane moment became evidence of something, not of guilt, but of how well the coming horror hid itself inside routine. That evening, behind the closed doors of the Rourke home, a confrontation took place that would become the fulcrum of everything that followed. Daniel had discovered messages on Maya's device, not explicit enough to involve law enforcement, but alarming enough to trigger every protective instinct a trained investigator and a father could feel simultaneously. He did not shout. That was never his style. Instead, he delivered controlled disappointment, the kind of parental authority that tells a teenager she has not just broken a rule, but lost access to the world she wants. He laid out new restrictions with the calm precision of someone filing a report. No phone overnight, no unsupervised outings until further notice. A counseling appointment scheduled for the following week. Maya sat across from him and listened. She nodded at the right intervals. She said the words adults want to hear. "I understand. You are right. I will do better." She sounded like compliance itself, but she was not complying. She was collecting information, cataloging the boundaries of her cage so she could measure the exact dimensions of what she intended to destroy. To Maya, the specific issue did not matter. The boy did not matter. The phone did not matter. What mattered was power, and who held it. In her world, her father's badge meant permanent surveillance. Everyone in the house lived under what felt to her like an invisible monitoring system, where every choice was reviewed, every movement tracked, every mistake filed away for future reference. Daniel believed structure prevented chaos. Maya believed structure existed to diminish her. The distinction between those two beliefs is where families fracture. Maya had begun talking in absolutes, the rhetorical weapon of adolescents who need their suffering to feel total. Her parents had ruined her life. They never trusted her. They wanted her miserable. The teenage brain has a documented capacity to turn discomfort into apocalypse, to feel restriction as annihilation. In most cases, the feelings pass. In Maya's case, they did not pass. They hardened into something operational. Maya knew where Daniel kept his equipment because Daniel believed in demystifying danger rather than hiding it behind mystique. He had taught his children about safety the way other parents teach about fire, by making them aware of the tool and its consequences rather than pretending the tool did not exist. Locked storage existed in the home, a secured cabinet that met federal standards. But routines create opportunities that even the most careful people overlook. Keys hang in the same place because convenience becomes habit. Codes remain unchanged because changing them feels unnecessary when trust is treated as permanent. Erin had once told a friend, half joking, that she wished Daniel would stop training the kids like tiny federal agents. She said it lightly, the way people say things that bother them without wanting to start a fight. That sentence, recovered later in witness interviews, would sound less like a joke and more like an unheeded prophecy. The knowledge Daniel shared in the name of protection had become in the wrong hands and the wrong heart, a toolkit for something he never imagined. Near midnight, the house quieted in its usual order. The younger children's lights went out first, followed by the soft click of Aaron's bedside lamp. Daniel's phone was plugged in on his nightstand, the screen going dark as the house settled into its final rhythm. Maya's door clicked closed last. In reconstruction, investigators would later flag an anomaly in the home security system's log. The system had been armed for the night, then disarmed, then rearmed within a narrow window of time. On paper, it could have been a glitch, a system hiccup of the kind that happens in electronic panels. In practice, it looked like someone testing whether the system recorded which user code had been entered and whether that log could be noticed in real time. And someone small, someone patient, someone confident enough to experiment with the household's protective infrastructure while the household slept. At 12:31 in the morning, a hidden cloud backup service captured a notification that Maya's device had sent a short message to a contact saved under a nickname. The message was brief and purposeful. If it is quiet by 3, it worked. The recipient was not yet identified. The message was deleted from Maya's screen within moments of being sent, scrubbed from her visible history as if it had never existed. But deletion on a device is not deletion from the world. Cloud servers, backup protocols, and carrier logs do not care about a user's intent to hide. They record and they store, and they wait, indifferent as stone, until someone with a warrant asks them to speak. Even before investigators touched the Rourke house, the truth was already sitting on servers in a data center somewhere, patient and permanent, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Around 3 in the morning, a neighbor's dog barked once. The sound was sharp and startled, the kind of bark that means a dog has noticed something unexpected rather than something routine. Then the dog stopped. Another neighbor, half awake in bed with the vague awareness of someone pulled from shallow sleep, later recalled a faint sound that might have been a car door closing very slowly, the kind of deliberate motion someone makes when they are trying not to be heard. There was no screaming, no crash of broken glass, no alarm blaring into the night. On just the kind of deep silence that falls over a house when something has changed inside it irreversibly, when the air itself seems to know that the people who lived there are no longer living. Maya would later tell investigators she slept through everything. She would describe herself as a heavy sleeper who heard nothing until morning. But the timeline disagreed with her, and in that disagreement, the case began to harden into something prosecutors could carry into a courtroom. Outside, porch lights glowed with their steady automatic timers, illuminating walkways as if nothing at all had changed. By sunrise, one small but critical object would be missing from the Rourke home. An object Daniel Rourke never misplaced. An object he accounted for with the obsessive regularity of a man who understood what it represented. Investigators would realize soon enough that it was not stolen in a break-in. It was taken by someone who already lived inside those walls. And the first responder who walked into that quiet house would feel something wrong in his chest before his eyes confirmed a single detail. The house felt wrong before it looked wrong. The night did not explode. It tightened. The 911 call came late in the morning, not in the chaotic small hours of the night when most emergencies scream into dispatch. That delay, those hours of silence between what happened and when it was reported, would become one of the prosecution's most potent tools. A young voice came through the line, shaking but careful, measured in a way that experienced dispatchers sometimes flag without being able to articulate why. The voice said she woke up and found her family not waking up. Dispatch heard what sounded like rehearsed panic, breaths placed in the pattern where panic should logically fall, but lacking the ragged authenticity of genuine shock. Officers were sent expecting a medical emergency, maybe carbon monoxide, maybe a health crisis that struck multiple family members. The street looked peaceful as they arrived. Birds, morning sun, a delivery truck rumbling softly down the block. The first patrol car rolled up like it was answering a routine welfare check, the kind that ends with paperwork and a polite nod. This one did not. The front door was locked. Maya opened it after a noticeable pause, a beat too long for a teenager who had just called for help and should have been standing at the threshold waiting for rescue. She seemed to need a moment, as if she had to select the right expression before turning the handle. Inside, the air felt stale and heavy, carrying a metallic undertone that the first officer recognized in a way his training had prepared him for, but his instincts still rejected. The hallways were dim. The house was too still. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere, no splintered doorframe, no shattered window, no evidence that an outsider had muscled their way into this home. That fact mattered enormously because it narrowed the narrative immediately. Either the person who did this was welcomed in, or the person who did this already belonged. Maya stood behind the responding officer, small hands twisting the fabric of her sleeves, watching his face with the attentiveness of someone studying a test rather than someone begging for help. The scene unfolded room by room in a way that responding officers would later describe with a single word that troubled them to use about a family home: methodical. Daniel and Aaron Rourke were found in the primary bedroom. The younger children were found in theirs. The absence of chaos was its own form of devastation. There was no overturned furniture, no shattered objects scattered across the floor, no visible signs of the desperate struggle that normally accompanies violence between people who want to live and someone trying to prevent that. The stillness suggested that each victim had been approached with surprise, with proximity, with the kind of trust that only exists between people who share a household. Officers backed out of the rooms, called for supervisors, sealed the house, and stood in the driveway with the particular expression that comes from witnessing something that rewrites what you thought possible. The home was no longer a home. It was a sealed container of questions. When Daniel Rourke's federal credentials were identified, the tone of the response shifted with visible speed. Local detectives were suddenly coordinating with contacts from the Bureau, not because the FBI was taking over the investigation in the way television dramas suggest, but because the death of an active agent triggers a different gravity entirely. Evidence chain protocols tightened. Phone calls were made up command structures. The street filled quietly with unmarked vehicles driven by people whose presence communicated seriousness without a single word. Neighbors peered through blinds, counting cars, trying to decipher what had happened by measuring the official response. The badge on Daniel's belt, once a symbol of the protection he provided to strangers and the discipline he brought home each night, now functioned like a silent alarm, summoning professionals who would treat every fingerprint, every fiber, every digital artifact like a potential trap set by someone who knew the rules. Detectives noted small inconsistencies that individually might mean nothing, but collectively began forming a pattern of staging. A back window had been left slightly ajar, but dust on the sill was undisturbed, as if the window had been opened from inside and never actually used as an entry point. A drawer in the kitchen had been pulled out as though someone had searched through it, but no valuables were missing. A kitchen knife sat on the counter, too clean and too conspicuously placed, as if arranged rather than used. The scene smelled faintly of cleaning product, subtle enough that it did not scream cover-up, but present enough to raise the eyebrows of professionals who had seen staged crime scenes before. And Maya's account of the night did not match what the house was showing them. She said she heard nothing. Yet the alarm system log told a different story entirely. An emergency medical technician offered Maya a shock blanket. She shrugged it off with a motion that felt more like annoyance than numbness. A neighbor who had rushed over tried to embrace her. Maya stood rigid, her eyes flicking past the neighbor's shoulder toward the growing cluster of police vehicles and investigators. When a detective gently asked where she had been during the night, Maya answered with a speed that felt rehearsed rather than reflexive. "In my room, asleep, all night." Then, without any apparent connection to the gravity of what was happening around her, she asked a question that the detective would remember and write down in his notes that same hour. "Can I call someone? I have school tomorrow." It was not the question itself that disturbed the detective. It was the timing and the tone. The way Maya reached for normalcy, like a person reaching for a shield, not because she craved routine, but because she needed the performance of normalcy to keep functioning. Inside Daniel Rourke's secured storage, one critical item was absent: his issued service weapon, not found on the scene, not found on any surface or in any room, not in the safe where it should have been stored. For a supposed intruder, stealing a federal agent's firearm might have made a certain criminal sense, except the safe itself showed no signs of forced entry. The code had not been brute forced. There were no tool marks, no drill holes, no evidence of the kind of violence that safes endure when someone breaks into them without authorization. The safe had been opened the way Daniel opened it, calmly and correctly, by someone who knew the code or had watched it entered enough times to learn it. The intruder narrative that Maya had presented began to wobble under the weight of that one missing object and the undamaged safe that had held it. As forensic technicians moved through the hallway, photographing every surface, one specialist paused near the side door that connected the house to the garage. There, on the threshold where carpet met concrete, was a faint partial impression. A shoe print, small and narrow, far too small for most adult men, too narrow to belong to Daniel Rourke. It looked like the tread of a youth sneaker, pressed lightly into the surface by someone moving carefully rather than running. It was not proof yet. It was a whisper of direction, a compass needle turning slightly toward something investigators were not yet ready to say aloud. Outside, Maya sat on the curb, face completely dry, watching the house with an expression that held no grief and no confusion, only a strange patience, as if she were waiting for the building to finish whatever it was saying to the people inside it. And the house was about to tell them everything. The door was locked from the inside. So was the truth. The medical examiner's work began the slow and merciless process of stripping speculation away from this case and replacing it with clinical fact. Time of death estimates for all 4 victims converged on the early morning hours, a window that stretched roughly from 2 to 4 in the morning based on physiological indicators documented at the scene and confirmed during examination. That timeline placed the deaths many hours before Maya's late morning call to 911, and the gap between those 2 points became the first major behavioral red flag that investigators circled with red ink. In true crime investigation, time gaps between a crime and its reporting are the spaces where lies breathe. A frightened survivor calls immediately. A shocked bystander calls as soon as comprehension arrives. A person who waits calls when the story is ready. Ballistic analysis indicated that the injuries were consistent with a firearm of the class and caliber that an FBI agent might carry as a service weapon. That finding did not prove it was Daniel's exact gun, not yet, because the gun itself had not been recovered. But it aligned with the missing item from the safe and tightened the circle of possibility into something investigators could feel closing. The pattern of the injuries suggested close range and familiarity with the layout of the home. There was no evidence of random spray or the kind of chaotic trajectory that accompanies an intruder firing in an unfamiliar dark house. Someone had moved through those bedrooms with purpose and proximity, approaching each victim with the knowledge of exactly where they slept. That kind of knowledge does not belong to strangers. It belongs to people who live in a home, who have walked those hallways in the dark 1,000 times, who know which floorboards creak and which doors swing silently. Technicians pulled the alarm panel history and printed a log that would become one of the prosecution's foundational exhibits. The log showed user-coded disarm and rearm events within the window between midnight and 4 in the morning. That single fact demolished the silent break-in story entirely. A skilled burglar might bypass an alarm system or disable it, but the panel did not record a bypass or a disruption. It recorded a valid user action, someone entering a correct code in the correct sequence, someone opening the system like they belonged to the household, because they did. Our investigators now had a skeleton of a timeline. The house was secured for the night, then briefly opened using an authorized code, then secured again, as if the person operating the system wanted the home to appear protected and undisturbed while something irreversible took place behind its walls. Phones and tablets belonging to the family were bagged, isolated from networks to prevent remote wiping, and queued for forensic examination pending warrants. Daniel's phone showed its last movement at a time consistent with the estimated window of the attacks. Aaron's phone ceased showing any activity even earlier, suggesting she was the first to be targeted. Maya's device told a different story altogether. It showed microactivity throughout the critical hours, small bursts of screen wakes and brief app opens followed by silences. It's the kind of pattern a person creates when they are checking messages in the dark, monitoring a timeline, waiting for something to happen, or confirming that something already has. Cloud services, even when content is deleted from a device's visible interface, retain echoes of activity in server logs and backup archives. Investigators do not need a confession when they have timestamps that feel nothing and forget nothing. Victim advocates and officers who interacted with Maya in the hours following the discovery documented behavioral observations that would later surface in court filings. Maya cycled through emotional expressions with a noticeable on and off quality, crying when an audience was present and going calm and flat-faced when she believed she was alone. She showed curiosity at unexpected moments, watching investigators with interest when she thought no one was looking at her. When told she could not return to the house, she did not plead for personal mementos or family photographs or any of the things a grieving child typically reaches for. She asked for her phone charger. A seasoned detective involved in the case wrote in his notes later that evening a line that would be quoted in the investigation summary. Her priorities were modern and immediate: device, access, control. Those 3 words were not proof of guilt, but they were proof that something was missing in the space where shock and grief usually live. Detectives began canvassing the neighborhood for any camera systems that might have captured activity during the critical hours. Most footage from surrounding homes showed empty streets, the uneventful recordings of a sleeping suburb that confirmed nothing dramatic. Then a neighbor mentioned a detail that changed the investigation's direction entirely. He had installed a small secondary camera on his property, pointed at a side driveway after experiencing a package theft several months earlier. The camera was modest, not high resolution, and positioned at an angle that happened to capture a sliver of the area near the Rourke garage. On it, time-stamped at 3:17 in the morning, was a figure, small, moving with deliberate care rather than panic, carrying something long wrapped in material, holding it close to the body, the way someone holds an object that matters. The face was not visible, but the figure moved with the confidence of someone who knew the path, who did not hesitate at corners or flinch at exposure. On someone who was not afraid of being there. Investigators now held 3 independent pillars of evidence that pointed in the same direction: a missing weapon from a safe that showed no forced entry, alarm system activity using a valid household code during the window when the family was attacked, and a camera-captured figure matching Maya's approximate size and build near the garage in the small hours of the morning. It still was not a complete case. Defense attorneys could argue coincidence. They could suggest a coerced child or an unknown intruder who somehow obtained the alarm code. But investigators were no longer chasing a vague possibility. They were building a chain, and the next link would come from the place teenagers consistently forget is permanent even when they press delete: their messages. On a server somewhere in a data center that Maya had never thought about, her deleted words were waiting to be brought back to life. The clock did not match her story, and clocks do not lie. With warrants authorized and served, forensic analysts began the slow, unglamorous work that breaks modern criminal cases with more reliability than any dramatic confession ever could. Device extraction, data reconstruction, deleted thread recovery, contact mapping, and timestamp analysis formed the foundation of an effort that treated Maya's digital life not as a teenager's private world, but as a crime scene in its own right. The noise of adolescent communication, the slang, the rapid topic changes, the performative humor, all of it had to be filtered so the signal beneath could be heard. Maya had assumed that pressing delete meant destroying evidence. But in the architecture of modern technology, deletion is almost never destruction. It is concealment from the user, a comforting illusion of control, while the record persists in server logs, cloud backups, and device artifacts that forensic tools can reconstruct with patience and precision. The most significant recovery was a chat thread between Maya and a contact saved under a single letter, the initial J. The thread had been partially deleted from Maya's device, but was reconstructed from cached artifacts and cloud backup fragments that her deletion had not reached. The tone of the messages was not frightened or conflicted. It was logistical. The language read like someone managing a project, confirming steps, anticipating obstacles, and checking variables. One message, time-stamped just hours before the murders, carried the cold clarity of a switch being flipped. After they sleep, no interruptions. Another message, sent even closer to the critical window, asked a question that revealed planning rather than panic. If the alarm logs show codes, does it matter? The questions were chilling not because they were sophisticated, but because they were practical. The language of someone who believed they were about to get away with something and wanted to make sure the small details were covered. Location data extracted from Maya's device painted a picture that contradicted her claim of uninterrupted sleep with precision that no alibi could absorb. The phone's location services recorded subtle positional shifts within the home during the same window. She said she was unconscious in bed. Not dramatic GPS coordinates tracking movement across town, but small micro-changes consistent with movement from room to room. Kitchen, hallway, garage side door. The kind of movement a person generates when they are trying to be very quiet, walking slowly, pausing, proceeding. Analysts cross-referenced these positional shifts with the alarm panel's log of user code entries and found the timing aligned with disturbing neatness. The data did not portray Maya as a bystander who woke up to an incomprehensible horror. It portrayed her as awake, active, and moving through the house with purpose during the hours when her family was being killed. Physical evidence corroborated what the digital trail suggested. Crime scene technicians had collected the partial sneaker tread found near the garage threshold, and comparison analysis matched the tread pattern to a pair of shoes recovered from Maya's closet. The shoes, a popular youth brand, showed a consistent tread design and carried trace residue on the sole that was consistent with materials found on the garage threshold surface. It was not a singular match that proved guilt by itself. It was corroboration, one more piece that fit into a picture growing clearer with every examination. Additionally, fiber analysis revealed that a bath towel was missing from the upstairs bathroom set, and lint-like traces found on a hoodie in Maya's laundry pile were consistent with the material composition of that towel. The fibers suggested something had been wrapped, carried, and moved exactly the action the camera footage depicted. Investigators explored motive with deliberate care. An understanding that motive is not legally required for conviction, but is psychologically essential for a jury to accept a verdict without lingering doubt. Maya's recovered messages spoke repeatedly of escape, running away, starting over, resentment toward living under what she called FBI rules. There were also threads suggesting financial desperation at the adolescent level, not family poverty, but a teenager's desire for money to fund independence. Rides, burner communication devices, a fantasy of a new life unshackled from parental authority. In several messages, she referenced inheritance in a way that could be read as dark teenage humor, the kind of edgy commentary teens trade without real intent. But placed on the timeline alongside planning messages and weapon access, that humor transformed into something deeply unsettling. If the motive was not a single clean reason, it was a combination: control, anger, the adolescent tendency toward absolute thinking, and a desire to erase obstacles. Interviews with Maya's school friends began to surface a portrait that corroborated what the evidence was assembling. Several described her recent fascination with being what she called unpunishable. One friend recalled Maya saying, with a confidence that felt like showing off, that her father knew how people get caught, and that meant she knew too. Another friend remembered an incident in a school bathroom where Maya practiced a crying face in front of the mirror, then laughed at her own performance. Not every teenage rumor is reliable. Detectives understood that adolescent social circles generate exaggeration and competitive storytelling. But when multiple independent accounts point to the same behavioral pattern, the pattern itself becomes significant. Performative emotion, fascination with evasion, confidence that consequences could be managed with the right face. Investigators began seeing personality not just as background, but as evidence of planning. Daniel's FBI colleagues arrived in the case with the restrained intensity of professionals who understood both the grief and the procedural demands of the moment. They did not contaminate the scene. They did not insert themselves into the investigation in ways that would compromise its integrity. But their presence shifted the temperature of every room they entered. The local police chief had to balance empathy with neutrality, acknowledging the loss while ensuring the investigation remained independent and unbiased. Nobody in law enforcement wanted to believe that an agent's own daughter had done this. The instinct was to look elsewhere, to find the outsider, to preserve the idea that an FBI household was impervious to the kind of threat that lived inside it. But evidence does not care about loyalty. In a quiet briefing between agencies, a senior FBI supervisor said something that landed in the room like a nail-driven flush. Treat her like any suspect. The badge does not shield a crime. It only magnifies it. By the end of the week, investigators had identified the person behind the initial J in Maya's contacts. The older teen's name was Jordan Klein. He was 17, with a history of minor offenses and a reputation for influence that outpaced his age. The question now expanded beyond whether Maya had killed her family. The question became whether someone had helped shape the idea, whether the plan had a second architect, or merely a willing audience. Detectives prepared a strategy built on separation and pressure. Interview Jordan. Isolate Maya from any coordinated narrative. And wait for the moment Maya realized the adults had moved beyond guessing and into knowing. In the interview room, a metal chair waited, bolted to the floor, empty but patient. It would not wait long. She deleted the messages. Not the evidence. The interrogation room was designed to strip away every advantage a suspect might carry in from the outside world. Neutral walls, the color of nothing. A table bolted to the floor so it could not be moved or used as a barrier. A camera in the upper corner that recorded without pause or judgment. The room had no personality, which was the point. It reflected back whatever the person sitting in it brought inside, and Maya Rourke brought composure so complete it felt rehearsed. She entered with a posture too collected for a child who had supposedly discovered her entire family dead just days earlier. She scanned the room once, taking quick inventory of the space the way her father might have taught her to assess an environment, then sat down. Detectives offered water. She declined with a small shake of her head that carried the energy of a power move rather than a preference. Her attorney had not yet arrived due to procedural timing at the juvenile level, and the lead detective, trained extensively in non-coercive interview techniques, kept the atmosphere deliberately gentle. The goal was never to bully or intimidate. The goal was to let Maya talk until her own words built the trap. Maya told her story with the fluency of someone who had practiced it. She described a masked intruder, tall and vague and conveniently lacking in identifiable detail. Black hoodie, gloves, moving fast through the house. She offered descriptions that sounded borrowed from crime dramas, the generic villain that every viewer has seen and no investigator has ever caught because he doesn't exist. She claimed she hid in her bedroom, paralyzed by terror, and that she did not call police because she froze, because her body would not let her move. Yet her voice did not shake as she delivered this account. She corrected the detective's small, clarifying questions with surprising confidence, as though she had already anticipated which details might be challenged. When asked about the alarm system's activity log, she shrugged with a casualness that felt calculated. Dad always said it. When asked about her phone showing activity during the hours she claimed to be unconscious, she smiled thinly and offered a line that would be replayed in court. Phones do stuff by themselves sometimes. The detective did not argue with her. He did not challenge her story directly or tell her she was lying. Instead, he employed one of the most effective tools in the interrogation playbook, patience combined with strategic silence. He asked a question and then let the silence after it grow, expanding into the room like a gas, pressing against Maya's composure until she felt compelled to fill it. She began offering explanations nobody had asked for, why she did not scream, why she did not attempt to flee the house, why she did not check on her younger siblings even after the supposed intruder left. Each unsolicited explanation created a new inconsistency, a new thread investigators could pull later. The detective asked soft, precise questions and then repeated them, using slightly different phrasing minutes later. Maya answered quickly the first time and grew visibly irritated when the same ground was covered again. Irritation is a significant behavioral leak. It suggests the subject is experiencing performance fatigue, the strain of maintaining a constructed narrative under sustained attention. Then the detective introduced a piece of information with deliberate casualness, as if it were an afterthought rather than a calculated detonation. He mentioned that several neighbors in the area had security cameras. Maya's eyes flicked involuntarily toward the interview room's own camera, then snapped back to the detective's face. For approximately half a second, something that looked very much like fear surfaced in her expression before being flattened into an expression of mild annoyance. She responded too quickly for someone hearing this information for the first time and processing it innocently. So what? Lots of people walk outside. That answer arrived preloaded, as if she had already considered the possibility of cameras and prepared a dismissal. The detective simply nodded, wrote something in his notebook with visible deliberateness, and let Maya watch him write. It was not intimidation. It was the theater of inevitability, the quiet demonstration that the investigation had moved beyond her narrative and into territory she could not control. When the detective shifted the conversation toward the victims, speaking about Aaron's kindness and the younger children's ages, Maya's empathy did not appear. She described her mother as dramatic and her siblings as always whining. The words were not a confession, but they were a window into something that made the room feel colder. Most children, even angry ones, even children in the grip of profound resentment, soften when talking about family members who have died. Their voices drop, their eyes shift. Something human surfaces even through defiance. Maya sharpened. She spoke about Daniel with undisguised contempt, describing how he treated her like a suspect her entire life. how she never had freedom, how everything in the house revolved around his rules. Then she laughed once, a quick exhalation under her breath, and said a sentence that stopped the detective's pen. Guess he was right. She realized immediately what the words implied and tried to walk them back, claiming she meant that her father was right about the world being dangerous. But the line had already been recorded, already entered the permanent record of the interview, and it hung in the room's recycled air with the weight of something that could not be unsaid. The detective asked about Jay. He used only the initial, watching Maya's face for the micro-reaction that would tell him whether the name carried weight. Maya's expression froze for less than a full second, a momentary stillness that the camera captured with indifferent precision. She claimed Jay was just a friend. Then she revised the description to someone from school. Then she said she didn't really remember. The shifting answer was significant because innocent recall typically stabilizes or clarifies with repetition, while deceptive recall deteriorates and contradicts itself. The detective offered Maya an exit, a strategic door designed to see if she would use it. He told her that if someone had scared her into something, if she was afraid, this was the moment to say it. Maya's face tightened. The offer of victimhood was visible to her, and some part of her clearly calculated its value. But accepting the narrative of being coerced meant surrendering the one thing she valued most: control. She chose control. That choice, documented on the interview recording, would later matter enormously during sentencing. After the interview concluded and Maya was escorted back to holding, the lead detective stepped into the corridor and released a breath he seemed to have been holding for an hour. He did not say she did it aloud. That declaration would wait for the evidence to be fully assembled and the legal strategy to be formalized. But he made two requests that signaled the direction of his thinking. He asked for a formal juvenile custody order to ensure Maya could not communicate with outside contacts unsupervised. And he requested a coordinated interview of the person identified as Jay to be conducted simultaneously by a separate team so that the two suspects could not align their stories. Maya's narrative was crumbling, and when a false narrative fails, the truth typically rushes in to fill the vacuum with a speed that feels almost inevitable. Behind the one-way observation glass, the interview room camera continued recording the empty chair and the empty table, patient as a judge waiting for the next session. Her tears were optional. The timestamps were not. The person behind the letter J turned out to be Jordan Klein, 17 years old, a junior at a nearby high school with a minor criminal record that included petty theft and a disorderly conduct charge that had been plea bargained into community service he never completed. Jordan was old enough to drive, old enough to buy influence in a 14-year-old's emotional economy, and old enough to understand that the things he said to a younger, angrier, more volatile person could have consequences beyond conversation. He was not a mastermind. Investigators recognized the type almost immediately, a teenager who believed himself smarter than consequences because consequences had never fully arrived in his life. He had skated through minor trouble with the ease of someone who mistook luck for skill. His phone was seized pursuant to a warrant, and his initial reaction was theatrical outrage, the kind of indignation that people perform when they want to appear innocent without understanding that innocent people also experience confusion and fear rather than pure anger. Jordan's first formal statement was a masterclass in deflection. He denied everything with the wide-eyed energy of someone who expects denial alone to close a conversation. Then, when pressed, he minimized. He talked to Maya, sure. Everyone talks. He didn't know her like that. They weren't close. He admitted they had discussed her parents, but he framed those conversations as Maya venting and him telling her to calm down. He insisted he had never been near the Rourke home and that he had nothing to do with whatever happened. But his denial had structural cracks that a trained investigator could see from across the table. He could not keep his timeline consistent. He placed himself at home all night, but could not name what he watched or when he slept. And he kept asking what evidence they had, which is a question innocent people sometimes ask too. But Jordan asked it with the cadence of negotiation rather than confusion, as if he were calculating what he might need to trade to protect himself. Digital forensic analysts placed Jordan's phone and Maya's phone side by side in a comparative timeline that told a story neither teen wanted told. Jordan's device did not place him physically at the Rourke home during the window of the attacks, which initially seemed to support his denial. But his phone showed he was awake, active, and messaging during hours far later than he claimed to have been asleep. More importantly, his device contained fragments of Maya's messages, some recovered from his own cloud backup even after deletion. The reconstruction showed a conversation that was not one-sided. Maya talked about escape, about freedom, about a life without rules. And Jordan did not discourage her. He echoed her language, amplified her grievances, and occasionally added phrases that sounded like encouragement wrapped in plausible deniability. One recovered fragment from Maya's side read clearly across both devices. "After tonight, no one can tell me no." Another, simpler and more devastating. "I will be free." Jordan's role crystallized into something prosecutors could articulate, perhaps not a participant inside the house, but a catalyst, a pressure amplifier, a mirror that reflected Maya's darkest impulses back at her with validation attached. In the days immediately following the murders, Jordan's digital behavior shifted in ways that investigators found deeply revealing. His search history showed queries that sounded like escape planning, cheap bus routes out of state, cash transfer applications that did not require identification, on how to change a phone number without losing contacts. None of these searches constituted proof that he had killed anyone, but they constituted proof that he believed something had happened that required a rapid change of plans. Investigators suspected Maya had promised Jordan money, access, a shared future built on the wreckage of her family. Teenagers do not understand how estates work, how insurance processes operate, or how inheritance is distributed through legal channels that take months or years. They understand the concept of getting everything and the fantasy of having enough money to disappear. Maya's messages referenced insurance in ways that demonstrated total ignorance of the mechanism, which made the references more horrifying rather than less. Because it showed how little connection to reality was required for her to justify what she did. While the investigative machinery ground forward, the community around the Rourke family gathered in grief that had no comfortable shape. A candlelight vigil drew hundreds to the sidewalk near the sealed crime scene, where people stood in clusters holding flames that flickered in a wind that felt too ordinary for the occasion. Daniel's photograph in his FBI uniform sat on a makeshift memorial beside Erin's favorite family snapshot, the one where she was laughing at something off camera. Bouquets piled up around photographs of the younger children, whose school pictures showed gap-toothed grins and the kind of trust that makes adults ache. People wept for the children most because mourning them felt like mourning innocence as a concept. Maya did not attend. Officials cited safety concerns and custodial restrictions. But the rumors that circulated were simpler and more painful. She did not even care enough to try. In cases like this, public grief becomes its own pressure system, pressing down on prosecutors to deliver a truth that can withstand the weight of communal anger. Detectives intensified the search for the missing service weapon, expanding the geography and deploying specialized teams. Storm drains within walking distance of the house were checked. Wooded areas bordering the neighborhood were grid searched. Retention ponds were surveyed with equipment designed to detect metallic objects beneath water. Canine units tracked scent trails from the Rourke property to the edge of a small park adjacent to the neighborhood, where the trail dissipated near a creek that ran along the park's boundary. Nothing definitive was recovered immediately, and the absence of the weapon created a strategic vulnerability for the prosecution. Without the firearm, the defense would have room to argue that an unknown person took the weapon and fled. The case was already strong on circumstantial and digital grounds, but high-profile cases that involve the death of a federal agent do not survive on merely strong. They survive on undeniable. Then a small break arrived from an unglamorous and entirely accidental source. A city maintenance worker performing routine inspection of drainage infrastructure near the creek mentioned to a patrol officer that he had noticed a teenager near the drainage area very early on the morning following the murders. The teenager was carrying something and moving quickly, the worker said, though at the time he thought nothing of it, because teenagers do strange things at odd hours. The description of the figure's approximate size and build was consistent with both the garage camera footage and Maya's physical profile. Detectives immediately designated a new search zone centered on the section of creek nearest the drainage point. If the weapon was there, submerged in slow-moving water and settling mud, the case would stop being a debate conducted in conference rooms and start being a certainty that could be carried into a courtroom and set on the table. Somewhere nearby, the missing piece was rusting toward truth. And a coordinated search team assembled along the creek line with the kind of methodical patience that makes real investigation look nothing like its fictional counterpart. There were no dramatic helicopter shots or urgent sprinting. There were grid patterns marked with tape and flags, metal detectors swept in overlapping arcs, magnet lines dragged through shallow water, and evidence technicians and waiters moving at the speed of thoroughness. The work was slow, physically exhausting, and profoundly unglamorous, which is precisely why criminals underestimate it. People who commit crimes and hide evidence tend to believe that once an object is out of sight, it has ceased to exist in any meaningful way. They do not account for the institutional patience of investigators who will search the same stretch of water for days because they understand that evidence does not decay on the timeline of human impatience. The area near the creek was close enough to the Rourke neighborhood to be accessible on foot in under 20 minutes, far enough to feel private and secluded in the dark. It was the kind of place a teenager would choose because it seemed like a way, without understanding how thoroughly law enforcement can map a way when they have time and resources and a reason to keep looking. The recovery moment, when it came, lacked the cinematic crescendo that audiences expect, and arrived instead with the quiet inevitability that characterizes real breakthroughs. A technician dragging a magnet line through a section of the creek bed felt resistance. The line caught on something substantial beneath the surface. The technician paused, adjusted grip, and applied steady upward pressure. Mud broke the surface first, dark and heavy. Then metal. A handgun emerged from the water, slick with creek sediment and partially wrapped in fabric that had begun to degrade from submersion. Nobody cheered. Nobody shouted. The team members simply stared at the object with the focused silence of professionals who understood that a case had just changed its fundamental shape. The weapon was photographed in position, bagged with chain of custody seals applied on site, and documented with the meticulous care of evidence that would eventually be shown to a jury and would need to withstand every challenge a defense team could construct. Back at the laboratory, technicians began the careful process of restoring the weapon's serial number, which had been partially obscured by water damage and deliberate surface alteration. Using established forensic restoration techniques, analysts recovered enough of the number to confirm what investigators already suspected. The firearm was Daniel Rourke's issued service weapon, the same gun that was missing from his secured home storage, the same caliber and class that ballistic evidence from the scene indicated. Ballistic testing matched spent evidence recovered from the crime scene to this specific weapon with a degree of certainty that transforms suspicion into proof. The evidentiary triangle closed with a sound only prosecutors can hear. Missing gun from a safe that showed no forced entry. Weapon recovered from a creek within walking distance of the house. Ballistic match confirming the recovered weapon was used in the commission of the crime. The mathematical odds of an unknown intruder accomplishing all of this without leaving forced entry marks, without triggering the alarm, without waking Maya, and without being captured on any camera, crossed from improbable into the territory of functionally impossible. Prosecutors do not need to prove impossible. They need to prove beyond reasonable doubt. And this was the kind of proof that juries understand not in their legal minds, but in their bones. Investigators reconstructed the pathway by which Maya could have accessed the secured safe without leaving the kind of damage that forced entry produces. The answer came from a source that was heartbreaking in its simplicity. Erin Roark's small parenting notebook, the one she kept with counselor names and reminders about Maya's moods, contained an entry from months before the murders that stopped investigators mid-breath. In Erin's neat handwriting, tucked between notes about a school conference and a dentist appointment, were 6 words. Daniel, change codes. Maya watching. It was not an accusation. It was a parental reminder. The kind of note one spouse writes to another about a household maintenance task that never quite makes it to the top of the priority list. But it showed opportunity. It demonstrated that Maya had been observed paying attention to the safe's access procedure. Detectives also learned through interviews with family friends that Daniel sometimes opened the safe in the course of explaining safety principles to his children, never handing the weapon to them, never treating it casually, but normalizing proximity in a way he believed was educational. The case's tragedy deepened with this revelation because the father's protective instinct, his belief that knowledge prevents harm, may have inadvertently supplied the familiarity that made the crime physically feasible. The decision to formally arrest Maya Roark was not treated with the dramatic spectacle that television has trained audiences to expect. The arrest of a 14-year-old in a familicide case follows specific protocols designed to balance the gravity of the charges with the legal protections owed to a juvenile suspect. Paperwork was filed. Custody protocols were activated. Social services were notified. A juvenile advocate was assigned to ensure Maya's rights were preserved throughout the process. Maya was informed of the arrest in a calm, procedurally correct manner. Her response was a question that officers documented in their reports because it captured something essential about her orientation to the situation. "So I am like, under arrest." "Arrest?" she asked. Yeah, as if the concept came in gradations and she was hoping for the lighter version. When confirmed that yes, this was a formal arrest on multiple counts, she rolled her eyes with a flicker of contempt at the inconvenience of it all. Officers noted the reaction not because demeanor is proof of guilt in a legal sense, but because demeanor is evidence of character, and character becomes critically relevant when courts must later evaluate remorse. Prosecutors filed a motion to transfer Maya's case from juvenile court to adult court, triggering a debate that would dominate local and eventually national conversation for weeks. The basis for the transfer request was the number of victims, the evidence of premeditation, post-crime concealment behaviors, and the calculated nature of the offense. And the juvenile system operates with treatment and rehabilitation as its central purpose and imposes maximum custodial limits that in many jurisdictions would have allowed Maya's release before her 30th birthday. The prosecution argued that 4 lives extinguished through planning and deception could not be adequately addressed within those limits. The defense responded with arguments about adolescent brain development, emotional vulnerability, coercion by the older Jordan Klein, and the well-documented science of impulsivity in the teenage mind. The court scheduled a transfer hearing. In the meantime, Maya was held in a juvenile detention facility, separated from the general population for safety. And staff at the facility would later report in testimony that Maya's primary complaints involved the quality of the meals and the absence of her personal phone. The family members who survived, an aunt, grandparents, cousins who had known Maya since infancy, were briefed on the weapon recovery and its implications in a meeting that no one wanted to attend. Grief shifted into a new form that has no comfortable name because it combines mourning with betrayal, in proportions the human heart was not built to process. They had not just lost Daniel, Aaron, and the 2 younger children. They had lost the version of Maya they believed existed, the child they had held as an infant, taught to ride a bicycle, celebrated at birthday parties. A grandmother sat in silence for a long time after the briefing, and then whispered a sentence that the victim advocate recorded because it needed to be remembered. "I babysat her. I know her laugh." That sentence carried a specific kind of pain, the agony of a mind trying to stitch together love and horror and finding that the thread breaks every time. When the gun surfaced, her story sank. Experts involved in the case cautioned against the kind of armchair psychological diagnosis that true crime media often indulges in without accountability. But Maya's documented behavior, observed by multiple trained professionals across different settings, fit patterns that prosecutors routinely emphasize in juvenile violent offender cases. She displayed a fixation on control that permeated every interaction, a need to manage narratives, saw direct conversations, and maintain the upper hand even in situations where she held no structural power. Her emotional affect was shallow and performative, activated when an audience required it, and deactivated when the audience disappeared. She spoke about her family members not as human beings who had been lost, but as obstacles, rules, walls that had been erected to restrict her freedom. Her sense of self was simultaneously fragile and inflated, easily wounded by any restriction and quickly soothed by fantasies of dominance and independence. The most disturbing aspect of her psychology was not the presence of rage. It was how rapidly she returned to mundane concerns after the most devastating event imaginable, discussing school, friends, and personal preferences as if the murders were a scheduling conflict that had disrupted her plans. A review of Maya's social media presence revealed a carefully curated persona built around the concept of being untouchable. She reposted quotes about revenge, power, and independence with the frequency of someone building an identity rather than simply sharing content. Captions about being misunderstood and uncontrollable appeared regularly. She used irony as camouflage, a sophisticated defensive strategy that allowed her to express genuinely dark thoughts while maintaining the escape hatch of claiming it was all a joke if confronted. Investigators found drafts of posts that were never published, compositions that sat in her notes application like rehearsals for a performance she was not yet ready to give. The language in these drafts referenced resetting her life and wiping the slate. Phrases that read as melodrama in isolation, but became evidence of premeditation when placed on a timeline that ended in 4 deaths. The words were not direct confessions. They were the emotional architecture of someone who had been rehearsing liberation through destruction for longer than anyone around her realized. The family dynamic between Daniel and Maya was dissected by investigators and mental health professionals seeking to understand not justification, but context. Daniel's parenting style was structured, rule-based, and investigative in nature. He approached his household with the same systematic thinking he brought to his professional work, and for many children, that kind of stability would have been a gift. But for Maya, discipline registered as surveillance, and authority registered as humiliation. Shown the distinction matters because the objective quality of parenting does not determine a child's interpretation of it. Structure does not cause violence. It merely provides a stage on which certain personalities may dramatize their rebellion to a degree that crosses into destruction. Maya experienced every boundary as a personal attack, every restriction as evidence that she was not trusted, and every conversation about consequences as confirmation that her parents were her enemies. Aaron's attempts to buffer this dynamic, to soften Daniel's edges and translate Maya's anger into something less threatening, became tools that Maya learned to manipulate rather than bridges that connected the family. In the juvenile facility where Maya was held awaiting her transfer hearing, staff documented behavioral observations that would surface in sentencing memoranda months later. Maya mocked another detained minor who was crying about her own circumstances. She complained regularly that the counselors assigned to speak with her were annoying and unhelpful, not because she had specific grievances about their approach, but because the concept of being helped implied she was damaged, and she resisted that framing entirely. She asked staff members on multiple occasions whether she could get a different judge, as if the judicial system operated like a customer service department where dissatisfaction could be escalated to a manager. She wrote in a facility-provided journal about the possibility of becoming famous and speculated about whether a documentary about her case would portray her correctly. These entries were not crimes. They were not evidence of murder. But they were windows into a moral landscape that appeared remarkably barren for a child who had just lost, or rather taken, her entire family. Jordan Klein's role in the events was positioned differently depending on who was arguing. Prosecutors treated him as an accelerant, someone who did not strike the match, but who poured fuel on a fire that was already burning. Jordan validated Maya's anger. He romanticized her desire to escape. He framed her parents as captors rather than caregivers, and her situation as intolerable rather than ordinary. He provided the kind of emotional reinforcement that can push an unstable person from fantasy to action. But the evidence suggested he did not plan the physical act, did not enter the house, and did not wield the weapon. The defense positioned him as the predator, an older male who deliberately manipulated a younger, vulnerable girl into committing acts she would not have contemplated independently. The truth likely lived in the uncomfortable middle that neither side wanted to occupy. An older teenager exploited a younger teenager's rage and instability, and the younger teenager still made a series of conscious, sequential choices that no amount of external influence can fully explain away. The intercepted note that Maya attempted to pass to another resident in the juvenile facility became a crucial exhibit in understanding her post-arrest mindset. The note was brief, only 4 lines, but its content was illuminating. Maya instructed the other resident to tell anyone who asked that Maya was scared of Jordan, that Jordan made her do everything, and that she didn't mean for it to happen. The language did not sound like the words of a frightened child reaching out for help. It sounded like public relations strategy, a calculated effort to shape perception and establish a narrative that she could later use in court. She was testing narratives the same way she had tested the alarm system, probing for what would register as believable. Investigators flagged the note as consciousness of guilt and as evidence of ongoing manipulation, demonstrating that Maya's instinct to control the story had not been diminished by arrest or custody. The note would later be used by prosecutors not as proof that she committed the crime, since other evidence handled that burden, but as proof that she understood what she had done and was actively working to minimize its consequences, rather than confronting its reality. The psychological portrait that emerged did not determine the verdict. Evidence determined the verdict. But psychology shaped the question that would follow the verdict, the question that would consume the transfer hearing and the sentencing and the public debate for months afterward. When a child commits a crime of this magnitude, what is she in the eyes of the law? Is she a broken child who can be repaired, a victim of adolescence and manipulation? Or is she an offender who used childhood as camouflage, exploiting the instinct of adults to protect the young as a tactical advantage? But the transfer hearing would force a judge to sit with that question and answer it in a way that carried real consequences. The courthouse doors opened and the debate walked in. She wanted control, so the court measured it. The transfer hearing drew a full gallery that included press, neighbors, law enforcement colleagues of Daniel Rourke, surviving family members, and members of the general public who had followed the case with the particular intensity that arises when a crime challenges assumptions about who is capable of violence. The judge kept the tone clinical from the outset, reminding those present that this proceeding was not a trial. No guilt or innocence would be determined here. The sole question was whether Maya Rourke's case should remain in juvenile court with its rehabilitative framework and custodial limits, or be transferred to adult court, where the full range of consequences would be available. Maya entered in a clean blouse with her hair neatly brushed, and her expression was rehearsed into something that hovered between vulnerability and composure. She looked younger than her charges and older than her age. When she sat beside her defense counsel, she glanced once at the gallery, not with the darting anxiety of a frightened child, but with the appraising calm of someone measuring a room. The prosecution's argument was built on a foundation of evidence rather than emotion. The state presented the case in its structural entirety. Multiple victims killed in a sequence that required sustained intent, premeditation evidenced by digital communications, post-crime concealment, including weapon disposal and scene staging, on a delayed emergency report, and behavioral indicators consistent with planning rather than impulsive reaction. The prosecutor emphasized the number 4 with quiet repetition, not as theatrics, but as a factual anchor. This was not one impulsive act committed in a flash of uncontrolled emotion. This was a sequence of events that required the perpetrator to make the same devastating choice multiple times in multiple rooms over a sustained period. Each step in that sequence represented a decision point where the person could have stopped. The prosecutor's voice did not rise. The evidence spoke in timestamps and laboratory results, the language of proof that does not require volume to be heard. The defense constructed an argument rooted in established science about adolescent brain development and the particular vulnerabilities of a 14-year-old mind under pressure. They cited the well-documented fact that the prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain responsible for impulse control, long-term planning, and consequence evaluation, does not fully mature until the mid-20s. They described Maya as emotionally volatile, psychologically manipulated by an older teen, and trapped in a household where discipline felt like imprisonment. Counsel argued that the juvenile system existed precisely for cases like this, cases where a young person commits a serious offense but retains the neurological and psychological capacity for change that adults may not. They pushed hard on the narrative that Maya was a child reacting to unbearable pressure in the only way her immature mind could process. It was a compelling argument because it tapped into a genuine human instinct, the belief that children can be saved. The problem was that this hope had to compete with a weapon pulled from a creek and an alarm log that documented deliberate, sequential action. During the arguments, Maya's behavior in the courtroom provided a live demonstration of the patterns that psychologists and investigators had documented. She displayed faint smiles at moments when gravity was required, including during the prosecutor's description of the younger children's bedrooms. She sighed audibly during legal arguments as though the proceedings were testing her patience. She whispered to her defense counsel at intervals, and whatever she said caused the attorney to stiffen visibly. When the judge instructed her to remain attentive and respectful, she nodded with exaggerated compliance, the kind of performative obedience that communicates its own mockery. The judge watched her with the careful attention of someone who has spent decades observing human behavior under institutional pressure and who knows the difference between fear and inconvenience. The gallery watched too, and in those small gestures, the spectators were already forming judgments that the judge's ruling would eventually formalize. The judge referenced what he called the objective anchors of the case, the evidence that did not depend on interpretation or speculation. The camera footage time-stamped at 3:17 in the morning. The alarm code entries logged under Maya's assigned user code. The device activity records showing wakefulness and movement during the hours Maya claimed she was asleep. The weapon recovery and ballistic confirmation. He acknowledged the defense's arguments about brain development with respectful seriousness, noting that the science was real and that adolescent impulsivity was a legitimate factor in understanding juvenile behavior. But then he drew a distinction that reshaped the hearing. The sophistication of this alleged offense is not found in brilliance, he said. It is found in the repetition of choices. planning, execution, concealment. Each of those phases required a separate decision. The question before this court is not whether a 14-year-old brain is different from an adult brain. It is whether this particular 14-year-old's demonstrated pattern of deliberate action can be adequately addressed within the juvenile framework's constraints. The judge granted the transfer to adult court, citing public safety, the gravity of the offense, and the evidence of sustained premeditation, while acknowledging with visible gravity the tragedy of applying adult standards to someone who was still a child by every measure other than her actions. The gavel came down with a sound that was absorbed by the packed courtroom's silence, and Maya's expression finally shifted from practiced composure into something unguarded. Anger moved across her face, quick and hot, the fury of someone who has been denied something they considered their right. It flashed for less than a second before she compressed it back into neutrality. But in that microsecond, the gallery saw what many had suspected and few had been certain of. Not a scared child processing an overwhelming system. An individual who was furious that the system had refused to bend to her will. The smirk returned as she was escorted from the courtroom, but it looked thinner than before, stretched across a face that was beginning to understand the dimensions of what was coming. Outside the courthouse, journalists waited with cameras and microphones, while community members argued in the parking lot with the passionate disagreement that cases like this generate. Some said the transfer was necessary, that 4 lives demanded adult accountability regardless of the perpetrator's age. Others called it institutional vengeance, are arguing that trying a child as an adult was an admission that the system had given up on rehabilitation before it began. Both positions contained truth, which is what made the argument impossible to resolve. Inside, prosecutors began preparing for the phase that would determine not just guilt, but the public's understanding of what had happened inside the Rourke home. The trial would require every piece of evidence to be laid before 12 jurors who would carry the burden of deciding whether a child who did adult things should face adult consequences. Maya, now facing the full architecture of the adult criminal justice system, began testing new strategies with her legal team. The next time she sat in a courtroom, the stakes would not be procedural. They would be permanent. The court did not see a child that day. It saw a choice. Trial morning arrived under a sky heavy with rain, the kind that makes courthouse steps shine like polished stone and transforms every approaching figure into a silhouette before they resolve into a recognizable face. Jurors filed into the courtroom with the careful, self-conscious expressions of people who understand they have been assigned something heavy and have not yet learned how to carry it. They settled into seats they would occupy for days, adjusting to the particular discomfort of being watched while watching. Maya sat at the defense table in a chair built for adults, and the visual disparity between her physical smallness and the institutional scale of the courtroom created an immediate tension that both sides would try to weaponize. The prosecution's task was to redirect the instinct to protect a child toward the actual children in this case, the younger siblings who deserved protection and did not receive it. The defense's task was to keep that instinct focused on Maya, the girl in the too large chair, the adolescent in the adult system. The prosecution's opening statement established a thesis built on evidence rather than rhetoric. This was not an intruder. This was not an accident. This was not a moment of lost control. This was a plan. The prosecutor walked the jury through the chain that connected each piece of evidence to the next, demonstrating that the case was not built on a single dramatic revelation, but on the accumulated weight of independent sources all pointing in the same direction. Alarm codes, digital messages, camera footage, weapon recovery, a ballistic confirmation, post-crime behavior including delayed reporting, scene staging, and active concealment. The prosecutor spoke in measured tones, allowing the evidence to carry its own emotional force without amplification. Then came the line designed to anchor in the jury's memory like a hook. She lived with an FBI agent and believed she had learned how to beat the system. The paradox was sharp enough to cut. The same training that was meant to protect the family may have given its youngest member the confidence to believe she could commit the perfect crime. The defense's opening painted a portrait of a different Maya, one trapped between an emotionally rigid home and a manipulative older teenager who exploited her vulnerabilities. Defense counsel conceded certain uncomfortable facts, knowing the jury would hear them anyway, and that early concession creates the appearance of honesty. Yes, Maya had lied. Yes, she deleted messages. Yes, she behaved strangely after the discovery. But these were the actions of a scared teenager, not a cold-blooded perpetrator. The defense suggested that investigative momentum, amplified by the emotional pressure of an FBI agent's death, had locked onto Maya early and interpreted every ambiguous fact through the lens of predetermined suspicion. They asked jurors to hold reasonable doubt like a shield, to resist the emotional gravity of the case and demand that every element of proof meet the standard that justice requires. The emotional target was empathy. If jurors felt protective of Maya, they might interpret each piece of evidence as consistent with coercion rather than independent decision. The first witnesses called to testify were the responding officers and crime scene technicians whose observations established the physical foundation of the case. Officers described the locked door, the absence of forced entry, and Maya's demeanor upon opening the door, the pause, the composed face, the strangely measured affect. A crime scene technician explained how the house's interior showed signs consistent with staging rather than genuine burglary. A window opened, but with undisturbed dust. A drawer pulled out with nothing taken. Valuables in plain sight, untouched. Photographs of the home were displayed for the jury with appropriate sensitivity, showing not violence, but the ordinary objects that had been transformed into evidence: a towel, a phone on a nightstand, an alarm panel displaying its log. The most powerful images were not gruesome. They were mundane. Family photographs on the wall. Children's shoes by a door. The jury began to feel the claustrophobic inevitability that the prosecution was constructing. The person who did this did not break in. The person who did this started from within. When the gallery reacted to testimony with quiet sobs and stifled sounds from relatives who could not maintain composure in the face of clinical descriptions of what had happened to their family, the judge intervened with firm but compassionate authority. "This courtroom will not become a second crime scene," he said. The language was not a rebuke of grief. It was a protection of the process, a reminder that the trial's function was analytical, not emotional, and that the emotions of the gallery could not be allowed to substitute for the evidence that the jury was obligated to weigh. Maya watched the judge's intervention with an expression that looked less like relief and more like appraisal, studying the judge the way she studied every authority figure in her life, not with respect, but with the calculating attention of someone measuring an opponent's patterns. A digital forensics analyst took the stand to explain, in language accessible to jurors without technical backgrounds, the fundamental principles that governed the recovery of deleted data. The analyst described how modern devices store information in layers, how deletion removes the visible pointer to data without actually destroying the underlying content, and how forensic tools can reach beneath the surface to reconstruct conversations, timestamps, and location patterns. The explanation was straightforward, which is what made it powerful. Jurors could understand it. They could picture their own phones, their own messages, their own assumption that pressing delete meant permanent erasure, and they could feel the sudden vulnerability of realizing how permanent digital traces actually are. The prosecution previewed one recovered message without reading its full content, promising context in subsequent testimony. Defense counsel objected to the preview as prejudicial. The judge allowed limited reference within bounds. Maya's jaw tightened visibly for the first time during the trial. During a recess, a courtroom reporter observed Maya whispering to her defense counsel with an expression that included a distinct roll of the eyes directed toward the jury box. The gesture was subtle, but visible to anyone watching, and several people were. Back in session, when a witness mentioned Daniel Rourke's years of FBI service and his reputation within the community, Maya's lips curved into what observers described as a sneer, a momentary expression of contempt that surfaced before she could flatten it back into neutrality. The prosecutor noticed. At least 2 jurors noticed. The defense counsel noticed and repositioned a folder on the table in a way that partially blocked camera angles from capturing Maya's face during subsequent testimony. In the framework of trial dynamics, it was a micro-event. But micro-events accumulate, and each one added weight to the prosecution's implicit argument. This defendant is not remorseful, not frightened, and not the coerced child the defense is describing. As the court adjourned for the day, the prosecutor announced the witnesses scheduled for the following session: the neighbor whose camera captured the 317 footage, and the laboratory analyst who would present ballistic findings linking the recovered weapon to the crime. The gallery rose slowly, with the particular heaviness of people leaving a place they did not want to be but could not look away from. Maya was escorted out last, head held high, her posture communicating defiance or denial or something in between that the jury would eventually have to name. The jurors went home carrying the same question that pressed against their thoughts with the insistence of something that would not wait. If she did not do this, why does every silent machine in this case say that she did? Tomorrow, the screen in the courtroom would light up, and the footage would speak for itself. Her face stayed calm, until evidence learned to speak. The neighbor who owned the garage camera took the witness stand with the apologetic demeanor of a man who hated being part of something this significant. He explained in plain, uncomfortable language that he had installed the small camera after repeated package thefts, that it was positioned to capture his own driveway, and that he never intended it to record anything more consequential than a delivery driver leaving a box on the wrong porch. He confirmed the camera's functionality, the accuracy of its timestamp, and the fact that he had not altered or edited the footage in any way. Then the prosecutor played the clip. The courtroom watched in silence as a small figure moved across the edge of the frame near the Rourke garage with a deliberateness that communicated control rather than panic. The figure carried a long object wrapped in material, held close to the body the way a person holds something that must not make noise. There was no rushing, no looking over the shoulder. The clip ended and the screen went dark. No music accompanied it. No narration explained it. The silence that followed was the commentary, and it said everything the prosecution needed it to say. The alarm company representative was called next. A technician who managed the monitoring service that the Rourke family had subscribed to. The representative explained how the alarm panel recorded events, specifically the distinction between a system breach, which would trigger an alert, and a valid user entry, which simply logged the action with a timestamp and user code. The panel's records showed that during the critical overnight window, the system was disarmed and rearmed using a valid code. The prosecutor introduced exhibits displaying which user code was entered. The Rourke family, following standard security practice, maintained separate codes for different household members, and the code used during the critical window was assigned to Maya's profile. Defense counsel objected, arguing that codes could be shared, memorized by other family members, or even entered by an intruder who had obtained the code through unknown means. The alarm representative acknowledged these theoretical possibilities while explaining that codes are typically assigned to individuals and that the system had no record of unauthorized access attempts. The judge allowed the exhibit. Jurors now possessed something that functioned like a digital fingerprint, an identification method that did not depend on eyewitness memory, lighting conditions, or the fallibility of human perception. The digital forensics analyst returned to the stand with charts and visualizations that translated raw data into a narrative the jury could follow. Phone activity was mapped against time, showing screen wakes and micro-location shifts consistent with movement within the Rourke home during the hours Maya claimed to have been asleep. The analyst explained the findings in human language rather than technical terminology. This pattern of device activity is inconsistent with sustained sleep, the analyst testified. It is consistent with a person who was awake and moving through different areas of the home. The prosecution did not claim GPS-level precision inside a residential structure, a claim that would have been scientifically overstated. Instead, they argued behavioral consistency across independent systems. The camera showed a figure near the garage. The alarm log showed Maya's code being used. The phone data showed Maya awake and mobile. 3 separate, unrelated systems maintained by 3 separate entities, all pointing toward the same conclusion without coordination or collaboration. Then came the moment the prosecution had been building toward throughout the trial. The prosecutor read aloud the recovered text message that had been sent from Maya's device to Jordan Klein's contact hours before the family was killed. If it is quiet by 3, it worked. The words moved through the courtroom like a cold wind. They were not dramatic. They were not literary. They were functional. The language of someone confirming a plan the way a person confirms a reservation, and that ordinariness was what made them devastating. Defense counsel attempted to reframe the message as teenage melodrama, as the kind of vague, edgy language teenagers use without literal intent. The prosecutor asked the analyst to confirm the timestamp. Confirmed. The prosecutor asked whether the message had been deleted from Maya's device after being sent. Yes, the analyst said, deleted from the device, but preserved in cloud backup and recovered through forensic extraction. The jury saw what the prosecution needed them to see, not a spontaneous emotional outburst, a plan measured by silence and verified by a clock. During cross-examination, the defense team pushed aggressively on alternative explanations. They suggested Jordan might have had access to Maya's device, that accounts could be shared, that the phone could have been used by someone other than Maya during the overnight hours. The analyst conceded that certain theoretical possibilities existed, but emphasized the weight of probability and correlation. Individually, one piece of evidence might be explained away. Together, the constellation of data created a pattern that alternative explanations could not account for without becoming implausible. The defense's strongest angle remained the coercion argument, the narrative that Jordan had pressured and manipulated Maya into actions she would not have undertaken independently. But that argument had a persistent structural weakness. Coercion does not typically produce the kind of careful, multi-phase post-crime behavior that Maya demonstrated. The staging, the deletion, the delayed reporting, the weapon disposal, the composed performance during the emergency call. These were not the actions of a panicked child doing what an older teen demanded. They were the actions of someone managing a situation with deliberate intent. A victim advocate who had worked with the Rourke family's surviving relatives took the stand briefly. She did not testify about evidence. She testified about humanity. She described the process of notifying the extended family, of helping relatives process information that the human heart is not built to absorb in a single sitting. She mentioned one detail that cut through the technical evidence like nothing else in the trial had managed to do. The younger children's backpacks were still packed for school that morning. They had been set by the front door the night before, ready for a tomorrow that never arrived. That single image, 2 small backpacks waiting for owners who would never carry them again, reduced the case from its forensic architecture to its emotional core. Jurors looked down at their notebooks. A relative in the gallery pressed a hand over her mouth. Maya stared forward, expression fixed in the careful neutrality she had worn throughout the trial, unchanged by a detail that changed everyone else in the room. By the end of the evidence phase, the defense had one remaining strategic avenue: create enough doubt about Maya's individual agency and intent to reduce the charges or secure a lesser outcome. Speculation circulated outside the courtroom that Maya might take the stand in her own defense, a decision that would give the jury their first unfiltered exposure to her demeanor and personality. Prosecutors quietly welcomed the possibility, understanding that Maya's pattern of performative emotion, contempt, and self-focus would likely alienate jurors rather than win their sympathy. And defense counsel appeared to be weighing the risk with visible uncertainty. Because if Maya spoke, the jury would measure not just the evidence against her, but the presence or absence of the one thing no forensic laboratory could manufacture and no digital recovery could simulate: remorse. And in this case, remorse was the commodity most conspicuously missing from the defendant's inventory. The house had no witnesses. So the machines testified. The prosecution's closing argument was constructed with the precision of architecture rather than the heat of rhetoric. The prosecutor stood before the jury and built a staircase. Each step was a piece of evidence, and each step led inevitably upward toward a single landing. An ordinary neighborhood, a locked door with no forced entry, on an alarm system disarmed using the defendant's assigned code. Camera footage capturing a figure matching the defendant's size and build near the family garage at 3:17 in the morning. Phone records documenting wakefulness and movement during hours the defendant claimed she slept. A recovered weapon confirmed as the victim's service firearm, found in a creek within walking distance of the home. Ballistic evidence matching that weapon to the crime scene. Deleted digital messages recovered from cloud servers containing a language consistent with premeditation. A delayed emergency call placed hours after the estimated time of death. And post-crime behavior that included staging, concealment, and ongoing manipulation. Step by step. No leaps, no guessing. A no emotional manipulation required because the evidence provided its own emotional force. The prosecutor turned to the jury and delivered the line that summarized the entire case in a single breath. She did not just lose her temper, she executed a plan and tried to write a different story over the truth. The defense closing focused on Maya's age with the intensity of a spotlight that refuses to move from its target. Counsel reminded the jury that Maya was 14 years old, an age when the brain is demonstrably incomplete in its development, when impulse outpaces judgment, when the influence of older and more experienced individuals can overwhelm a young person's capacity for independent decision-making. The defense argued that the investigation had been colored from the beginning by the emotional pressure of an FBI agent's death, that the community's need for answers had funneled investigative energy toward the most available suspect rather than the most responsible one. Jordan Klein, they argued, had manipulated a vulnerable girl into something she could not fully comprehend. The defense asked jurors to imagine their own children at 14, impulsive, emotional, easily swayed, capable of terrible mistakes, but also capable of growth and change. It was an effective appeal precisely because it targeted the universal parental instinct. But every time defense counsel had to confront a specific piece of evidence, the emotional power of the argument weakened, because asking 12 adults to ignore what cameras recorded and servers preserved requires a trust in narrative that evidence has already broken. The judge delivered jury instructions with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that the words he chose would frame the decision these 12 people carried into their deliberation room. He explained reasonable doubt not as an abstract legal concept, but as a practical standard, the kind of doubt that would make a reasonable person hesitate to act in the most important affairs of their own life. He explained the difference between sympathy and judgment, between emotional reaction and evidentiary conclusion. He enumerated the elements required for each count and reminded the jury that their verdict must be based solely on the evidence presented in the courtroom and the law, as he had instructed them to apply it. "You are not here to answer whether you feel sorry for anyone," he said. You are here to answer what the evidence proves." Maya watched the judge speak with an expression that remained unreadable to most observers. The jurors filed out. The courtroom waited in a hush that felt like being held underwater, suspended between two possible futures that could not coexist. The deliberation lasted through the remainder of the first day and into a second day, which felt longer than both combined. Outside the courthouse, reporters rotated through shifts, cameras pointed at doors that remained closed. Inside, relatives of the Rourke family sat holding each other's hands with knuckles white from the sustained pressure of waiting for something that would hurt regardless of its direction. A box of tissues traveled along the front row like a shared burden, unpassed from one person to the next with the wordless understanding that grief does not observe individual boundaries. Maya's demeanor shifted between boredom and irritation during the wait, as if the delay personally offended her. At one point she leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes, and allowed a faint smile to cross her face. Whether it reflected a private thought, a defense mechanism, or genuine indifference, no observer could determine with certainty. But everyone who saw it filed it in the same category, the category of things that should not be possible. When the jury returned, the courtroom rose with the mechanical unity of people responding to a gravity they can feel but cannot see. Or the foreperson stood with a sheet of paper that trembled almost imperceptibly in hands that understood the weight of the words they were about to release into the world. The first count was read, and the word fell into the room like a stone into still water. Guilty. A sob escaped from somewhere in the gallery, immediate and uncontrolled. The second count, guilty. The third count, guilty. The fourth count, guilty. Each word landed with the dull, permanent force of finality, not a dramatic crash, but the sound of a door closing that would never reopen. Maya's face tightened. The smirk she had worn like armor throughout the proceedings failed to appear. Her eyes darted once to the side, quick and calculating, and then fixed forward with the frozen quality of someone whose internal computation has finally produced an answer they cannot accept. The defense requested that the jury be polled individually. Each juror confirmed their verdict aloud. It was not a misunderstanding, it was not a procedural error. It was a conclusion. Relatives of the Rourke family collapsed into each other quietly in the rows behind the prosecution table. There was no triumph in their posture, no celebration, no satisfaction. Only the particular exhaustion that arrives when truth has finally been named after weeks of hearing it denied. An FBI supervisor who had attended every day of the trial from the back row of the gallery lowered his head and held it in his hands for a long moment. The prosecutor did not celebrate. She closed her trial folder with the controlled, deliberate motion of someone completing an obligation that she had never wanted to carry. The judge set sentencing for a date several weeks in the future and remanded Maya into custody pending that hearing. As Maya was escorted from the courtroom, she turned slightly and swept her gaze across the gallery as if searching for someone whose face still held belief in her innocence. Nobody moved. Nobody met her eyes with anything she could interpret as rescue. The door closed behind her, and the courtroom breathed. The next phase would determine what justice actually looked like for a 14-year-old convicted of extinguishing her own family. Defense attorneys prepared mitigation materials, including psychological evaluations, developmental assessments, and expert testimony on juvenile brain plasticity. The prosecution prepared victim impact statements and a final exhibit, the neighbor's camera footage, which would be played one more time during sentencing as a reminder that truth is recorded in real time and does not bend to accommodate the stories people tell about themselves afterward. On sentencing day, Maya would attempt a new performance, and the judge would answer it with a number. 4 names, 4 verdicts, 1 silence. Sentencing day carried a different atmospheric pressure than the trial. The adversarial tension had dissolved, replaced by something heavier and more solemn, the gravity of reckoning. The courtroom filled early, as if people understood instinctively that arriving first was a form of respect for what was about to happen. The front row held framed photographs that were not evidence exhibits, but memorials, unplaced by surviving family members who needed the dead to be present in the room where their lives would finally be measured against the law. Aaron's photograph showed her laughing at a family picnic, caught in a moment of unguarded joy. Daniels showed him in his FBI uniform, serious and steady, the professional face of a man whose private life was defined by warmth. The younger children's school portraits displayed gap-toothed grins and bright eyes, and the kind of irrepressible trust that childhood manufactures before the world teaches it otherwise. Those images were not arguments. They were presence, and their presence changed the room's chemistry before a single word was spoken. Maya entered in custody attire, appearing smaller than ever against the institutional architecture of the courtroom. She glanced at the photographs and looked away immediately, as if direct eye contact with the faces of the dead might cost her the composure she had fought to maintain. A grandmother spoke first during the victim impact phase, and her voice trembled with the effort of maintaining coherence while describing a loss that coherence cannot contain. She spoke about Aaron's kindness, the way she remembered everyone's birthday, and noticed when someone at a gathering was standing alone. She spoke about Daniel's quiet service, the years he spent protecting strangers while building a home he believed was protected by his own vigilance. She described the younger children with the specific detail that only someone who loved them could provide. The way the boy insisted on wearing the same pair of sneakers until they fell apart because they were his lucky shoes. The way the girl sang to herself while drawing pictures at the kitchen table. Then the grandmother turned toward the defense table, not with hatred or rage, but with the bewildered grief of someone whose heart had been broken by a person it had previously trusted completely. "I loved you before you understood what love costs," she said, addressing Maya directly. The sentence landed in the courtroom and did not leave. An aunt followed, speaking in a voice that was quieter, but no less devastating. She described the practical aftermath of the family's destruction, the tasks nobody warns you about when grief arrives. Packing up the children's bedrooms, sorting through toys that still smelled like the hands that held them. Finding drawings labeled Mom and Dad in crayon handwriting that would never develop into adult penmanship. She described holidays that would never include the people who made them matter and family gatherings that would always have empty chairs where laughter used to sit. She told the court that she woke up every morning and for one merciful second forgot what had happened and then remembered, and the remembering was its own daily violence. The courtroom did not sob loudly. It grieved in the restrained adult manner of people who have learned that some pain is too large for public expression, hands pressed over mouths, eyes squeezed shut, shoulders shaking with the effort of holding something enormous inside a body not built for it. The defense presented mitigation evidence with the focused urgency of an argument that knew it was the last argument available. Psychological evaluations were entered into the record, documenting Maya's developmental profile, her emotional regulation deficits, and the clinical opinion of experts who believed that adolescent brain plasticity provided a genuine, if narrow, pathway toward eventual transformation. Defense counsel argued that life sentences imposed without any possibility of future review created permanent outcomes based on the actions of a mind that was, by scientific definition, not yet fully formed. They did not deny guilt. That battle had been lost. Instead, they argued for a sentence that included the possibility, however distant, of eventual parole review, a mechanism that would allow Maya's future self to be assessed decades later by a board equipped to evaluate whether change had actually occurred. The argument was the most human version of the defense's case. The idea that society can punish without abandoning its fundamental belief that people, even people who have done monstrous things, are not permanently and irrevocably defined by the worst moment of their lives. The prosecution's sentencing argument responded with a focus on the nature of the choices Maya had made and the completeness of the destruction those choices produced. The prosecutor spoke about choice as a recurring event rather than a single moment, emphasizing that the crime required sustained decision-making across planning, execution, and concealment phases. She referenced Maya's post-crime behavior with clinical specificity. The deletion of messages, the staging of the scene, the delayed emergency call, the composed performance during the initial interview, the intercepted jailhouse note revealing ongoing narrative manipulation. Then the prosecutor delivered the sentence designed to anchor the judge's deliberation. Rehabilitation requires remorse, and this court has seen strategy instead. She asked for consecutive sentences consistent with state law and the constitutional framework governing juvenile offenders, emphasizing public safety and the irreplaceable nature of what had been taken. Her tone was not angry. It was conclusive. When offered the opportunity to address the court directly, Maya stood and read from a prepared statement in a voice that sounded coached and calibrated. She said she was sorry for the pain. She said she was sorry for how things happened. She said she was sorry for the mistakes she made. The words were technically present, but the substance was conspicuously absent. She did not say the victims' names. She did not describe specific memories of the family she had taken. She did not offer the kind of raw, unstructured grief that signals genuine contact with the reality of what one has done. The apology circled responsibility without touching it, approaching the center of truth and then pulling away each time proximity became uncomfortable. At one point, Maya glanced upward at the judge, a quick assessment of whether the performance was registering the way she intended. The judge's face remained expressionless, and the moment felt like watching someone attempt to purchase mercy using a currency that everyone in the room could see was counterfeit. Maya sat down. The courtroom waited for the judge to speak. The judge began by acknowledging the profound tragedy of sentencing a child for an adult crime, recognizing the weight of the moment and the absence of any outcome that could be called satisfying. He referenced the science of adolescent brain development and conceded its legitimacy. He spoke about the purpose of the justice system with a clarity that silenced every competing thought in the room. Then he delivered the ruling's central principle, the distinction that would define the case in legal memory. Youth explains vulnerability, he said. It does not erase deliberation. He walked through the objective evidence one final time. Camera footage, on alarm code records, device activity, weapon recovery, ballistic confirmation, recovered communications. Then he spoke about the human cost, the smaller bedrooms, the packed backpacks, the unfinished homework, the empty chairs that would remain empty at every future gathering. Under the state's sentencing structure and the constitutional framework established by the Supreme Court regarding juvenile offenders, the judge imposed 4 life sentences, one for each victim, with parole eligibility only after a substantial minimum term of 40 years, to be served consecutively. Additional time was attached for related offenses, including evidence tampering and obstruction. The gavel fell. The sound was not loud. It was permanent. Outside the courthouse, there was no celebration. There was exhale. And the community's sustained anger did not transform into joy, but softened into something closer to bleak relief. The recognition that the truth had been spoken and given a place to sit, even though the speaking did not repair the damage. Daniel's law enforcement colleagues held a private memorial in the days following, honoring his service and the devastating irony that the greatest threat to his family had lived inside his own home. Aaron's friends organized a scholarship in the names of the younger children, a small gesture of continuity designed to ensure that something bearing their names would continue to move forward in the world even though they could not. The Rourke house was eventually sold. The lawn was retrimmed. The cul-de-sac returned to its rehearsed version of normalcy. Its morning joggers and school buses and garage doors opening on schedule. But nobody who lived on that street forgot what happened behind the locked door. In custody, Maya's first documented question after sentencing was about the timeline for filing an appeal. The system answered in paperwork, not emotion. The smirk did not survive the gavel. The case of Maya Rourke settled into the public consciousness not as a story with a clean ending, but as a question that refused to stop echoing. In the months after sentencing, the debate continued in comment sections and classrooms and dinner tables across the country, fueled by the fundamental tension that the case embodied. What do we do when a child commits an act so devastating that the word child seems to lose its meaning? Some argued that the sentence was just, that 4 lives demanded accountability regardless of the perpetrator's age, and that treating Maya as an adult was not cruelty, but clarity. Others argued that sentencing a 14-year-old to a term that effectively spans a lifetime represents the system's failure to honor its own stated belief in rehabilitation and the capacity of young minds to change. Both arguments carried weight, both contained truth, and neither offered the kind of resolution that allows people to close the file and move forward without looking back. The surviving members of the Rourke family entered a new chapter of existence that no one would choose and no one can prepare for. The grandmother who spoke at sentencing continued to visit Daniel and Erin's graves on a schedule that became ritual, standing in weather that ranged from punishing sun to freezing rain, because presence was the only form of love that still had a destination. The aunt who had described packing up the children's rooms eventually moved to a different city, not to escape the memory, but to escape the geography that housed it. She told a counselor that every street in Ashford Ridge held an echo, every playground, every school zone sign, every intersection where she had once driven the children. The scholarship fund in the younger siblings' names grew modestly but steadily, collecting contributions from strangers who had never known the family, but who recognized in their story something that demanded a response. The money would fund classroom resources and reading programs, ensuring that something alive continued to carry the children's names forward. Jordan Klein, whose role as an accelerant was established during the investigation, but whose direct participation in the physical act was never proven to the standard required for a murder charge, faced his own legal reckoning. He was charged with accessory-related offenses, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice based on his digital communications with Maya, his post-crime behavior indicating awareness, and his failure to report what he knew. His plea arrangement resulted in a significant prison sentence that reflected his contribution to the planning environment without equating his culpability with Maya's. The sentence satisfied almost no one, which may be the most honest thing that can be said about it. Those who believed Jordan was the true architect of the crime felt he escaped too lightly. Those who believed Maya acted independently felt he received more than he deserved. The truth, as it almost always does, lived in the middle, in the uncomfortable space where influence and agency overlap without a clean dividing line. In the juvenile facility where Maya spent her initial months before transfer to an adult institution upon reaching the age threshold, staff documented a behavioral trajectory that tracked with professional expectations but still managed to disturb those who witnessed it. Maya adapted to the custodial environment with the same calculating efficiency she had brought to every other environment in her life. She identified which staff members responded to charm and which responded to compliance. She adjusted her behavior based on who was observing, a pattern that had defined her interactions throughout the case and that showed no signs of fundamental change. Counseling sessions were described by therapists as performative, with Maya providing the responses she believed were expected without engaging in genuine self-examination. When asked about her family, she spoke in generalities that avoided emotional specificity. When asked about remorse, she used language that sounded like it had been assembled from things she had heard other people say about feeling sorry. The mask had not been removed. It had been resized for a new audience. The legal system's handling of Maya's case would enter the broader conversation about juvenile justice reform in the years that followed. Advocates on both sides cited the case for their purposes. Those who argued for stronger accountability pointed to the premeditation, the concealment, and the complete absence of remorse as evidence that some juvenile offenders demonstrate a level of intentionality that the juvenile system is not equipped to address. Those who argued for rehabilitative approaches pointed to Maya's age, her developmental profile, and the scientific evidence that adolescent brains are still forming as reasons why permanent sentences should never be imposed on minors regardless of the crime. The conversation produced no consensus because the case itself offered no comfortable resolution. It sat at the precise intersection of competing truths, a place where justice and mercy argue without a referee, and where every answer creates a new question. And the neighbor who owned the garage camera that captured the 317 footage never installed another camera after the trial. He told a reporter in a brief interview that he could not look at the system without seeing what it had shown him, and that some knowledge makes the tools that produced it feel permanently tainted. He had stumbled into the evidentiary center of a murder case because he wanted to protect his packages, and the disproportion between that original purpose and its eventual consequence haunted him in ways he could not fully articulate. His small, cheap camera, mounted at an imperfect angle on a residential driveway, had produced the single most important piece of visual evidence in the case. He said something in the interview that resonated beyond its intended scope. You think your life is going one way, and then a machine you barely think about shows you something that changes everything. That observation applied to more than just his camera. The Rourke home changed hands and eventually changed appearance as new owners renovated in the way people do when they are trying to make a space forget its own history. New paint, new landscaping, a different mailbox, structural modifications that altered the silhouette enough to disrupt recognition. But the street remembered. The neighbors who remained from the time of the murders still paused when they passed, still felt the particular atmospheric shift that certain houses carry after absorbing events too large for their walls. The cul-de-sac went back to being what cul-de-sacs are designed to be: quiet, predictable, reassuring. Children played on lawns and rode bicycles on sidewalks, and the bus came and went on schedule. Life did what it does after tragedy. It continued, not because the tragedy was resolved or forgiven or understood, but because continuity is the only mechanism available to communities that have absorbed a shock they cannot metabolize. The case left behind two questions that true crime audiences carry with them long after the details have faded from memory. The first is whether justice was served or whether it was only the closest approximation that the legal system can offer when perfection is impossible. 4 lives were taken. 1 person was held accountable. The punishment spans decades. But no sentence returns the dead, no verdict repairs the surviving family, and no amount of institutional process fills the spaces left by people who were supposed to grow old. The second question is harder and perhaps unanswerable. If Maya Rourke is ever granted parole decades from now, what would redemption look like after 4 lives? What form could change take that would satisfy a world that watched a 14-year-old smirk in a courtroom? The judge's final words on sentencing day echoed beyond the courtroom walls and into the broader conversation about what justice means when children break the most fundamental rules that civilization depends on. Accountability is not cruelty, he said. It is the boundary that protects the living. If justice mattered in this case, it mattered because the evidence refused to be charmed and the system refused to be manipulated. The cameras did not care about her age. The timestamps did not respond to her smile. The alarm log did not accept her story. And the creek gave back what she tried to hide. If you believe this story matters, make sure others see it too. The smirk did not survive the gavel. And the truth did not need permission to arrive.